Well, let's see. Over the next 90 minutes, we're going to be delving into the ins and outs of mobile app development. In thinking about this discussion today, it occurred to me that if there is one, if you will, overarching concept that I'd like you to take away, it is just how complicated an app development project can become. Even something very simple frequently has many moving parts and is not initially as complex as it appears, but can quickly become so. The complexity and duration of the process is frequently underestimated by businesses wanting to kind of quickly achieve an app presence. All too often we kind of see a ready, fire, aim approach to an app development project. And as we'll be discussing today, it is very important to think about the overall project to begin with, to identify all of the moving parts and to make sure those parts come together to create what it is you're trying to achieve. Before we reach the agenda, I thought it would be useful to talk about two sort of real-world app development projects that we recently worked on, and then we'll turn to the agenda. And these two examples show just how complex, but also how interesting an app development can be. So the first example is we worked with a consumer home products company. They're actually internationally recognized, and they wanted to create a very robust app that would allow customers to use the app in the stores, to view various products, even within the context of their own home, to be able to quickly locate nearby suppliers, to scan SKU and QR codes on the boxes of their products, to check availability, to check product specifications, even to place orders directly. And so they started this project thinking that at most it would probably be a month or two. The app development itself actually involved 3 different developers in 3 different countries, and that's actually not an unusual situation. In many instances, we'll look for experts in particular types of apps that they develop, and we'll find them in potentially other countries. And like I say, we generally have at least one offshore developer involved in most larger app development projects. So they had 3 baseline developers working on the project. The first problem they encountered was that none of those developers wanted to serve as sort of the general contractor for the project. So this consumer home product company, which is not a technology company, had to serve as the general, not a position it was excited about. So they had the 3 agreements with those 3 developers, and they had to be able to weave their various work product into the app. In addition to the components of the application furnished by those developers, there were also applications, pre-existing applications and libraries that they had to license from third parties to weave together to create their application. Again, this is a very common thing, to take established pieces of code and to integrate those into the new project to quickly get to a completed app. And so in this case, they licensed a virtual reality engine. They had a payment processing application that they had to license. They licensed some graphical user interface components. They had to enter into licensing agreements for APIs with social media providers. They had various open source software libraries for use on specific mobile operating systems. And then lastly, they had to license readers for SKU, UPC, and QR code readers. Once the app was completed, the business needed not only an end-user license agreement for the end users who would be getting the application, they also needed to update their privacy policy to take into account the new uses of data that they would be, the new data that they would be collecting and using. They also needed to enter into developer agreements with each and every one of the various app stores through which they were going to make the app available. All told, there were nearly 24 contracts in this project. Front to back, it took over 6 months to get the right agreements in place, do the development, integrate the pieces, submit the app for approval to the various app stores, and finally have the app in the hands of the end users. Again, this is not an unusual example. One further example which highlights a relatively common problem is revenue sharing in applications. A particular company wanted to have in-app purchases, and as you may know, many times that means there must be an app sharing with the App Store through which the application is made available. The guidelines from the App Store on revenue sharing were vague at best, so the company decided that they would contact designated experts at the App Store to discuss how revenue sharing would be calculated. Remarkably, they talked to 3 representatives of the App Store on 3 different occasions and got 3 completely different answers. After 2 months of effort, they were unable to get clarity on the issue of revenue sharing for the particular thing they wanted to do, and they ultimately simply had to pick one and hope they would not be found out of compliance. So with those 2 examples in mind, let's turn to a quick review of the agenda for our discussion today. We're going to start by spending just a few minutes talking about some big picture items for app development that likely all of you are familiar with. We'll talk about some trends in app development, including alternatives to sort of the now traditional app, which is the locally installed application that's purchased through an app store. We'll talk about the preliminary risk assessment that we consider to be one of the absolutely most important steps in the process. The objective is to determine the criticality of the app to the business, the type of data being placed at risk, required timing for rollout, and other relevant issues, so that these types of risks, these types of objectives are identified at an early stage, clearly defined, and then they guide the entire app development process. Talk about App Store T's and C's. We'll need to identify when you're developing a new app, what app stores you want to sell through, Windows, iOS, Android, BlackBerry. You'll want to figure out what terms apply. Those terms are, of course, moving targets. They're provided through URLs. Those URLs may change with their content at any time. Generally, these agreements are presented as non-negotiable. Your protection, as we'll discuss, is that there is safety in numbers. That is, that the agreement you're signing up to is the same agreement that almost everyone else is signing up to, whether you're a large company or a very small company. Next, application development. As I mentioned, sometimes we're using offshore developers. A lot of times, because the best apps are frequently developed by the smaller companies, you'll be dealing with small entities that may not be familiar with the kind of contracting practices sophisticated companies generally use. And so sometimes we find ourselves in the position of having to educate app developers about the concerns we have with the app development and how we might want to reflect those concerns in a contract. We still encounter developers today, smaller developers, who don't necessarily appreciate the risk of including open source software with viral licenses, and we'll talk about that in a bit, in an expensive app development that could ultimately place the intellectual property that they're developing at risk. Talk about third-party proprietary software. This is software that is pre-existing, that we would want to license to add to the application that we're developing. Examples that I've already given are like a payment processing engine or service, or a QR code reader, or hooks to the APIs provided by social media providers. And so each of those elements needs to be identified and the relevant contracts reviewed. Let's see if we'll get a slide to move to the next, and for some reason it's not flipping down, but we'll continue. Next, there's open source software, and as I mentioned, the problem with open source software is that it's provided, first of all, under a potential license which has a viral aspect, meaning that if you distribute certain types of open source software with proprietary software, it may impact your ability to protect the intellectual property in the proprietary software that you've created. Put more clearly, you could spend $500,000 on an application to develop some very custom code, wrap that with a piece of software, open source software, governed by, say, the general public license, which is a very popular open source license. In fact,